The guns had barely gone silent when Joseph Stalin opened a new front in the struggle for Europe. It was a war without uniforms or declarations, a war fought in the dim corridors of ministries, in the sealed files of intelligence services, and across the negotiating tables where the future of entire nations would be decided. Many in the West believed that victory over Nazi Germany would bring an age of cooperation with the Soviet Union. But behind the smiles of Yalta and the handshakes of Potsdam, Stalin was already orchestrating a vast operation designed to reshape the post-war map in his image. He understood something the Allies had not yet realized. The vacuum left by the collapse of the Third Reich created an opportunity not through tanks, but through information, and more importantly, through the manipulation of it. As millions celebrated the end of the fighting, Soviet intelligence agencies were retooling themselves for a mission unlike any they had undertaken during the war. The NKVD, SMERSH, and the Red Army's GRU were being redirected from hunting spies and traitors to influencing borders, governments, and even the perceptions of Allied leaders themselves. Stalin did not simply want security for the Soviet Union. He wanted control over the political destiny of Eastern Europe, and he believed the West could be guided, or deceived, into conceding that influence. Much of the world had not yet seen the full cost of the war. Entire regions of Poland, the Baltics, Belarus, Ukraine, and Romania lay in ruins. Populations had shifted violently. Records were destroyed, governments collapsed, and local institutions were wiped away. This chaos created the perfect environment for a disinformation campaign. With demographic data shattered, with no reliable census, with refugees flooding across borders, Stalin recognized that the truth was malleable. Reports could be forged. Ethnic compositions could be exaggerated or invented. Political movements that barely existed could be portrayed as rising forces demanding Soviet-aligned governance. And in a world desperate to stabilize itself, the Western allies were often willing to accept whatever information seemed plausible enough to keep negotiations moving. In Moscow, Stalin convened quiet meetings with his intelligence chiefs. Their mission was clear. The Soviet Union must emerge from the peace conferences not merely as a victor, but as the architect of a new political geography. The Red Army had occupied Eastern Europe. That was brute force. But to turn occupation into legitimacy, and legitimacy into permanent control, Stalin needed something subtler. He needed stories, documents, testimonies, and data that would justify Soviet claims. If reality did not align with Moscow's ambitions, then reality could be adjusted. Even as Allied delegations prepared for the final moves of diplomacy, Soviet officers were already seeding forged reports into the channels the West trusted. Resistance, movements, local councils, underground networks, and even the documentation of war crimes. Some of these documents were crafted in Lubyanka's deepest offices, others by field operatives who understood exactly what types of evidence Western intelligence agencies preferred. Each forged report, each manipulated map, each exaggerated account of political sentiment served a single purpose: to shift the negotiation lines just a little further east, a little further south, a little closer to Stalin's strategic design. What made this campaign so effective was that it did not always rely on outright fabrication. Often, it twisted fragments of truth, capitalizing on the confusion of the post-war period. A village destroyed by the Wehrmacht became evidence of ethnic cleansing that justified Soviet annexation of territory. A small group of socialist activists became a popular movement, demanding a Soviet-aligned provisional government. Border disputes that could have gone either way were tilted decisively by Soviet demographic reports, stating that the majority of a region's population identified as pro-Soviet. even if those people no longer existed or had never been surveyed. The West was exhausted. Britain was bankrupt. The United States wanted demobilization, and Europe was a humanitarian disaster zone. The last thing Churchill, Roosevelt, or later Truman wanted was another confrontation. Stalin understood this perfectly. He knew that the Western Allies would not dig too deeply into the origins of every Soviet claim, not when digging could mean weeks of delay, new conflicts, or the collapse of diplomatic unity. So he gave them information that looked authoritative, stamped with official seals, backed by supposed eyewitnesses, and presented at the perfect moment to close a debate. What emerged was a battlefield of maps and papers, of whispered intelligence and staged political scenes. It would become one of the most consequential information wars in modern history. A campaign that quietly, almost invisibly, redrew the borders of nations and set the foundation for the Iron Curtain that would dominate global politics for the next half-century. And in the shadows of this campaign, one mystery loomed larger than all others. How much did the Western Allies truly understand about Stalin's deception? And how much did they choose to ignore? Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next declassified file. In the spring of 1945, while Europe tried to comprehend the scale of destruction left behind, Stalin activated a system already perfected during the darkest days of the Great Purges. The NKVD, once the instrument of internal terror, now became the architect of outward-facing political manipulation. Its officers knew how to rewrite reality. They had done it for years inside the Soviet Union, erasing enemies, shifting blame, constructing narratives that justified every new expansion of state power. Now that same machinery was turned outward, aimed not at Soviet citizens, but at diplomats in London, Washington, and Paris, who still hoped cooperation with Stalin was possible. At the center of this effort was Lavrentiy Beria, the man who had overseen the NKVD's most ruthless operations. Beria understood Stalin's intentions instinctively. The USSR had paid a tremendous price in blood and ruin, and Stalin believed that price purchased the right to reshape Eastern Europe however he saw fit. But brute force alone could not hold territory indefinitely. The Red Army could seize land, but political legitimacy was required to keep it. And legitimacy, Stalin insisted, must be manufactured in the eyes of the world. To achieve this, Beria expanded a specialized network within the NKVD dedicated to fabricating political landscapes. In Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, East Prussia, and the newly occupied German territories, NKVD officers embedded themselves into local administrations, intelligence bureaus, and temporary committees established in the vacuum of collapsing governments. Their job was not merely to observe, it was to create. If a region lacked a pro-Soviet political movement, one could be invented. If numbers did not support Moscow's territorial claims, the numbers could be adjusted. If the West demanded public support for a provisional government, staged rallies could be organized, photographed, and documented as proof. Beria's operatives were also masters of disruption. When Western envoys attempted to verify local political conditions, Soviet forces conveniently delayed their travel, restricted their movement, or presented them with curated witnesses who parroted Moscow's preferred narrative. What these envoys often didn't know was that the NKVD had been preparing these narratives for months, sometimes even before the Red Army arrived. Destruction from combat made it easy. Burned archives, missing census records, and displaced populations meant few could challenge the authenticity of Soviet-provided data. If a report claimed that 70% of a disputed region's population favored Soviet administration, who could prove otherwise? The old records were ash, and the living were too terrified to contradict the voices appointed to speak on their behalf. SMERSH, the wartime counterintelligence agency, played a crucial supporting role. Though primarily tasked with eliminating Nazi infiltration, SMERSH units also provided cover for NKVD political operations by controlling who could speak to Western investigators. Anyone considered unreliable, whether they were former resistance fighters, anti-communists, or even neutral local officials, could be detained or disappeared under the pretext of security concerns. Their absence then became part of the narrative. There is no opposition here, Soviet officers would explain, only fascist remnants who must be dealt with. And the West, wary of being seen as sympathetic to fascists so soon after victory, rarely challenged the framing. Meanwhile, the Red Army's GRU contributed by crafting military intelligence assessments that supported Stalin's geopolitical designs. Reports about the threat of anti-Soviet partisans, about unrest in regions the USSR sought to control, and about the necessity of Soviet administrative oversight flowed directly into diplomatic discussions. Though some Western intelligence officers suspected manipulation, they lacked the resources or access to counter it. The chaos of the post-war environment overwhelmed even the most diligent analysts. At the diplomatic level, Soviet negotiators were trained to present their claims with absolute certainty, reinforcing the idea that their data was not merely correct, but unquestionable. And when disputes arose, Stalin employed a simple tactic. He refused to compromise, calculating that the West would eventually concede rather than risk prolonging negotiations. On matters like the borders of Poland, the fate of the Baltic states, and the administration of Eastern Germany, the Soviets simply held their ground and flooded the conversation with documentation that suited their position. Behind every Soviet claim lay a pile of papers, stamped, signed, and presented as authoritative truth. Reports on ethnic composition, political sentiment, war damage, population displacement, and historical precedent. But many of these documents were crafted in the offices of the NKVD, carefully tailored to support whatever outcome Stalin desired. The West was not equipped to challenge such an organized campaign. Their own intelligence systems were fractured by demobilization. Their analysts were tired. Their governments were under pressure to bring soldiers home. And above all, they still hoped for a post-war partnership with the Soviet Union. Stalin exploited that hope with precision. As these disinformation campaigns took root, entire nations found their political destinies slipping out of their own hands. Borders were not being decided by treaties alone, but by forged testimonies and manufactured impressions. Arguments made in smoke-filled conference rooms were reinforced by deceptive field reports that diplomats mistook for reality. And while Allied leaders debated the future of Europe, Stalin's operatives were already shaping that future on the ground, ensuring that by the time the ink dried on any agreement, the Soviet version of events had become the only version left standing. Yet for all the sophistication of Stalin's political deception, there was one campaign so brazen, so carefully constructed, and so brutally enforced that it became the foundation of Soviet control over Eastern Europe, the creation of puppet democracies that appeared legitimate to the world while functioning as instruments of the Kremlin. That operation lay at the center of Stalin's plan, and it would change Europe forever. In the months after Germany's surrender, Stalin faced a challenge that brute military power alone could not solve. He could occupy Eastern Europe, but occupation was not the same as political control. The world was watching. The Allies expected free elections. And the nations lying between Germany and the Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, all carried memories of independence, and in many cases, deep suspicion of Moscow. Stalin needed to transform these countries without appearing to conquer them. He needed governments that looked independent, sounded democratic, and could be presented as the legitimate will of the people. And so began one of the most calculated political operations of the 20th century, the Soviet creation of puppet democracies. The strategy hinged on a simple illusion that the people of Eastern Europe were naturally moving toward communism, grateful for Soviet liberation, and eager to reshape their societies under Moscow's guidance. But the reality was far more complex. In Poland, the government in exile held enormous respect. In Hungary, voters overwhelmingly favored non-communist parties. In Czechoslovakia, while communists had influence, they were far from the dominant force. None of this fit the narrative Stalin required, so the NKVD and local communist parties were tasked with manufacturing a different story. The process always began with the same first step: intimidation. NKVD officers, working with local communist activists, quietly removed anyone who could challenge their narrative. Politicians disappeared. Journalists were arrested. Resistance fighters who had spent years battling the Nazis were suddenly labeled fascists or saboteurs. Stalin understood that a political landscape must be cleared before it can be reshaped, and once the opposition was silenced, the Soviets could begin constructing the illusion of democratic choice. Next came the coalition governments, temporary administrations designed to reassure the West that democracy was functioning normally. In these coalitions, communists often held only a few posts, usually ministries considered minor or technical. But beneath the surface, those posts were crucial. The communists always demanded the Interior Ministry, the office that controlled the police, security forces, and voter registration. They took the Ministry of Information, controlling radio stations and newspapers, and they targeted the Ministry of Justice, shaping the courts that would later legalize their assent. From the outside, the government looked balanced, even moderate. But inside, the communists controlled the machinery that defined political reality. Elections soon followed, or rather, the appearance of elections. Soviet-backed parties campaigned with resources no other group could match. Their opponents faced censorship, arrests, or sudden scandals manufactured out of thin air, flyers, posters, and leaflets supporting. Non-communist candidates mysteriously vanished. Ballot boxes were protected by newly formed security units loyal to the communist-dominated interior ministers. And in regions where communist support was weak, voter rolls were altered, extended, or outright invented. The communists rarely needed to win outright. They only needed enough seats to claim a mandate, which they then expanded through arrests and purges of elected opponents. Once inside the government, the communists activated the next phase of Stalin's plan, the narrative of inevitability. Newspapers published articles claiming the people had spoken decisively in favor of socialist progress. Public rallies were staged, with NKVD supervision, showing crowds waving red flags and praising Soviet friendship. Radio broadcasts repeated the same message. Communism was not being imposed. It was being embraced. Western journalists arriving in these nations during the fragile period of reconstruction often saw only the surface, the flags, the crowds, the official statements. Few realized how carefully orchestrated these scenes were. Meanwhile, the NKVD supplied fabricated intelligence to Western embassies asserting that anti-communist groups were secretly collaborating with former Nazis, that monarchists were plotting armed uprisings, or that nationalist parties were preparing a return to authoritarian rule. These reports, stamped and signed by what appeared to be legitimate agencies, gave the Soviets moral justification to tighten their grip. Western diplomats, already overwhelmed by the scale of post-war recovery, lacked the means to verify or refute these claims. And as Stalin expected, they rarely challenged Soviet actions when those actions appeared to be keeping extremist forces in check. Gradually, the coalition governments were transformed from inside. Communists denounced their partners as reactionaries. Political rivals were put on trial using doctored evidence. Newspapers loyal to non-communist parties were shut down for alleged violations of public order. And when cabinet ministers objected, communist-controlled police units raided their offices or arrested their aides. One by one, non-communist parties either surrendered their independence or dissolved entirely, unable to function as their members faced constant intimidation. By the late 1940s, the transformation was complete. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and eventually Czechoslovakia stood as people's democracies, each claiming to be the product of popular will, each holding elections in name only, and each taking orders directly from Moscow. Stalin had not needed to conquer these nations by force. He had absorbed them through a methodical, relentless manipulation of information, perception, and political reality. To the West, it appeared as though Eastern Europe had simply chosen a different path, but beneath the surface lay a vast system of forged documents, staged events, controlled media, and carefully crafted illusions. This system was so effective that even decades later, newly opened archives continue to reveal the depth of Soviet involvement and the extent to which Western governments either underestimated the operation or chose not to confront it. Yet for all the political manipulation carried out in Eastern Europe, one operation stood out above all others, both in scale and secrecy. It was a deception that touched the very heart of Soviet relations with the West, buried beneath layers of lies that would not fully unravel until the Cold War was nearly over. It began in a forest outside Smolensk, at a place called Katyn. In the thick forests near the village of Katyn, on land scarred by war long before the German invasion, lay the graves of more than 20,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, and civic leaders, the backbone of Poland's national identity. They were killed in the spring of 1940, executed with precision by the NKVD, under direct orders from Stalin. But the significance of Katyn extended far beyond the massacre itself. It became the centerpiece of a deception so elaborate, so fiercely defended, that it shaped Allied diplomacy, silenced investigations, and remained a fault line in East-West relations for half a century. Katyn was not simply a war crime. It was a geopolitical weapon. When German forces uncovered the mass graves in 1943, they believed they had stumbled upon evidence that could fracture the Allied coalition. Berlin immediately broadcast the discovery, declaring that the Soviets had murdered the Polish prisoners long before the German invasion of the region. The timing was designed for maximum impact. The Polish government in exile in London demanded an independent investigation, and suddenly the uneasy alliance between Stalin and the Western democracies faced a dangerous moment. Stalin could not allow the truth to take hold. If the Allies accepted German claims, even accidentally, the entire moral legitimacy of Soviet participation in the war would be thrown into question. So Moscow responded with a deception campaign that displayed the full force of Soviet disinformation capabilities. Within hours of the German announcement, the Soviet press accused the Wehrmacht of committing the atrocity in 1941 during their advance into Smolensk. The NKVD produced hastily crafted evidence, including forged documents and staged witness testimonies, presenting a timeline that framed the Germans as the perpetrators. This narrative was not designed to withstand forensic scrutiny. It was designed to buy time and shape diplomatic perception. Stalin knew that in war, controlling the first version of an event was often enough to determine how it would be remembered. The Soviet story insisted that the Polish prisoners had been working in the area during 1941 as part of road construction units, captured and executed by the Germans when they retreated. Soviet propagandists claimed that German officers had forced local villagers to dig graves and fabricate testimonies about Soviet guilt. To reinforce the lie, Soviet medical teams staged examinations that proved the remains had been buried in 1941, not 1940. These conclusions were circulated among Allied diplomats with the authority of official investigation. Behind the scenes, Stalin deployed one of the most aggressive diplomatic offensives of the war. When the Polish government in exile requested an inquiry by the International Red Cross, Stalin exploded in fury, accusing them of colluding with Nazi propaganda. It was a calculated move. By framing the request as disloyalty, he severed diplomatic ties with the Polish government, clearing the way for the creation of a Soviet-controlled alternative that would later serve as the foundation for communist rule in Poland. Katyn, therefore, became a tool not only for masking a crime, but for shaping the political destiny of an entire nation. The Western Allies faced an impossible dilemma. Privately, British and American intelligence analysts found the Soviet version implausible. Reports sent to London and Washington concluded that the timeline, burial conditions, and physical evidence all pointed to NKVD responsibility. But publicly acknowledging this would risk splitting the coalition at the height of the war. Churchill, who viewed victory over Nazi Germany as the absolute priority, made a grim, pragmatic choice. He instructed his ministers to avoid challenging the Soviet narrative, noting in one letter that the truth would be revealed when the war is over. Roosevelt's administration took a similar stance, suppressing reports that contradicted Soviet claims. For the sake of maintaining unity against Hitler, Katyn was buried beneath layers of silence. Stalin interpreted this silence not as caution, but as weakness, affirmation that the West would swallow even the most brazen lie if it meant preserving the alliance. And so, the deception continued. After the war, as Soviet forces tightened their grip on Eastern Europe, the Katyn narrative was woven into Soviet historiography. Textbooks described the massacre as a Nazi crime. Monuments were built with inscriptions blaming Hitler's forces. Anyone within the Soviet bloc who questioned the official story faced imprisonment, harassment, or worse. The survivors of the Polish officer corps, scattered across the world, carried the truth like a scar. But behind the Iron Curtain, the lie remained law. The deception became so absolute that it entered diplomatic protocol. At post-war conferences, when Polish representatives from the communist government echoed the Soviet version, Western delegations spoke in careful phrases, avoiding open contradiction even when they knew the truth. The Soviet Union, sensing its advantage, used Katyn as proof of its own reliability, while quietly reminding the West that too many uncomfortable truths could destabilize the fragile post-war order they were trying to build. It wasn't until the late 1980s, under the pressure of newly emerging archival evidence and political reforms, that Moscow finally admitted responsibility. Even then, the acknowledgement came wrapped in vague language, avoiding direct blame on Stalin or the men who carried out his orders. But by that time, the deception had already served its purpose. The post-war map of Europe had been drawn. The Soviet sphere of influence was secure, and the truth, delayed for decades, could not undo what Stalin had achieved through lies. Katyn revealed something essential about Soviet strategy. Disinformation was not a temporary wartime tactic. It was a governing philosophy, a means of shaping reality itself, and it would be deployed repeatedly as Stalin sought to secure control over territories the USSR could neither afford to lose nor justify keeping by honest means. One of the most critical of these campaigns involved Poland, the country Stalin viewed as both a buffer and a threat. And controlling its borders required deception on a scale the West was not prepared to confront. For Stalin, Poland was not merely a country, it was a corridor, a strategic buffer through which Napoleon had marched to Moscow, through which German armies had invaded in 2 world wars. To secure the Soviet Union's western frontier, Stalin believed Poland had to be reshaped, geographically and politically, until it no longer resembled the nation that had existed before 1939. This meant shifting its borders westward, absorbing its eastern territories into the Soviet Union, and constructing a new Polish state whose very identity depended on Moscow's approval. And to do this, he unleashed a disinformation campaign that blended selective history, forged evidence, exaggerated demographics, and the exploitation of wartime chaos. The starting point was simple. Stalin claimed that the eastern regions of pre-war Poland, areas like Lviv, Vilnius, and the territories of Belarus and Ukraine, had always belonged to the peoples of the Soviet Union. He argued that the Polish state had seized them illegitimately after the First World War, imposing its rule on ethnic Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Lithuanians, who supposedly longed for reunification with their cultural homelands. These claims were only loosely rooted in historical tensions, but Stalin understood that history, when presented with confidence, often carried more weight than the messy realities buried beneath it. To support this narrative, NKVD and GRU officers prepared detailed reports describing Polish rule in the interwar period as oppressive and colonial. They highlighted incidents of conflict, magnified isolated injustices, and framed the entire region as naturally aligned with Soviet culture. The goal was not accuracy, it was persuasion. And in 1945, when diplomats were desperate for stability, a document stamped official carried enormous influence. Yet history alone could not justify the scale of territorial change Stalin wanted. So the Soviets manipulated demographic reports as well. Census data from before the war was selectively rewritten to portray Poles as a minority in large swaths of territory the USSR sought to annex. Entire communities displaced by the conflict were classified according to whatever ethnic label suited Soviet claims. In some areas, Ukrainian and Belarusian populations were inflated to demonstrate overwhelming support for Soviet governance. In others, Polish communities were described as remnants of a landlord class, whose objections were politically biased and therefore irrelevant. Western diplomats struggled to challenge these reports. The war had obliterated records, burned town halls, and scattered populations across thousands of miles. The people who could testify accurately were often refugees, still on the move, or simply missing. The NKVD took full advantage, presenting their fabricated data as the only remaining evidence. Even when British or American analysts doubted the figures, they lacked the means to conduct independent surveys in regions tightly controlled by Soviet occupation forces. And so, confronted with uncertainty, the West often accepted Soviet data by default. The most significant breakthrough for Stalin came at Yalta, where Roosevelt and Churchill, eager to preserve the alliance and move the negotiations forward, reluctantly conceded to the idea of shifting Poland's borders westward. The official justification rested on Soviet claims about historical rights and ethnic realities, claims shaped almost entirely by NKVD reports. What the West did not fully grasp was that these facts had been carefully assembled long before the conference. Stalin had built his case knowing that once Poland's eastern territories became Soviet soil, reversing the decision would be politically impossible. But while Stalin expanded his borders to the east, He compensated Poland with German territory to the west, a move that served multiple strategic purposes. First, it created a permanent source of tension between Poland and Germany, ensuring that Poland would always seek Soviet protection. Second, it allowed the USSR to present itself as a generous benefactor rather than a conqueror, emphasizing that Poland was not losing land but exchanging it. And third, it provided further justification for the installation of a Soviet-aligned government in Warsaw. After all, the argument went, only a friendly Polish regime could administer such a major territorial transformation. The NKVD crafted yet another layer of deception to support this Western shift, exaggerated reports of German atrocities and claims that entire regions were historically Slavic and therefore rightfully Polish. While German war crimes were real and horrifying, the selective presentation of evidence helped Moscow push the narrative that removing German populations was not only justified but necessary for long-term peace. As millions of Germans were expelled from their homes, Soviet officials framed the forced relocation as a natural correction of history, never acknowledging that the upheaval also helped solidify communist control in Poland by eliminating potential opposition along the borderlands. By 1946, when the West finally realized the full implications of Stalin's territorial settlement, it was too late. The population transfers were already underway, the new borders were already being taught in schools, and the Polish provisional government, built on foundations of intimidation, propaganda, and Soviet-backed political manipulation, stood as a loyal partner to Moscow. The impact of this border deception was profound. Poland emerged from the war as a nation transformed. Its cultural and political center shifted hundreds of miles westward, its historic cities divided between two countries, its population fractured by forced migration. And all of it had been achieved through a narrative crafted in Lubyanka's offices, a narrative that the world reluctantly accepted because the alternative was diplomatic chaos. But Stalin's disinformation campaign did not stop at Poland. In the Balkans, another strategy unfolded, one that combined staged uprisings, forged intelligence, and the exploitation of local rivalries to ensure that Romania and Bulgaria fell securely into Moscow's orbit. These operations were just as sophisticated and just as effective, revealing the broader pattern behind the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe. In the Balkans, Stalin found a region defined by shifting loyalties, fractured identities, and governments weakened by years of war. Romania and Bulgaria were technically Axis states, though neither had committed wholeheartedly to Hitler's cause. Their leaders hoped that by switching sides at the right moment, they could preserve some measure of sovereignty. But Stalin saw opportunity in their desperation. If Poland was reshaped through historical manipulation and demographic deception, the Balkans would be taken through a mixture of intimidation, forged intelligence, and political theater designed to portray Soviet domination as a liberating force rather than an occupation. Romania collapsed first. By 1944, its armies were exhausted, its government isolated, and its people living under the constant threat of German retaliation. When Soviet forces approached the country's borders, Romanian leaders scrambled to negotiate a ceasefire that would keep them from being treated as conquered enemies. But Stalin had no interest in compromise. Even as back-channel negotiations continued, the NKVD prepared reports describing a massive, fictional pro-Soviet underground movement inside Romania, a people's resistance, supposedly waiting for the Red Army to liberate them from fascist oppression. These reports were circulated widely, shaping the diplomatic landscape before a single Soviet unit entered Bucharest. The truth was that no such resistance existed. Romania's political landscape was divided and uncertain. with most citizens simply concerned about survival. But Stalin understood that perception mattered more than reality. When Soviet troops entered the country, NKVD officers organized stage celebrations in key cities. Small crowds brought in by party activists, photographed carefully to give the impression of mass enthusiasm. Western journalists saw these scenes and reported them as spontaneous expressions of relief, reinforcing the illusion that Romania was embracing Soviet influence willingly. Behind the facade, the NKVD moved quickly to neutralize potential opponents. Romanian officers, politicians, and intellectuals were arrested based on forged accusations of Nazi collaboration. Some had ties to Germany, others did not. It made no difference. The goal was to clear the political field of anyone capable of leading a movement independent of Moscow. Meanwhile, Soviet-backed communists, a group small in number but loyal to the Kremlin, were elevated into positions of authority. They were presented to the outside world as representatives of the Romanian people, though few Romanians had ever heard of them. The most decisive moment came during the armistice negotiation. The Soviet delegation presented intelligence reports alleging that German agents were still operating within the Romanian government, preparing to sabotage the transition of power. The evidence was fabricated, but it provided the justification Stalin needed to demand complete political oversight. Romanian leaders, facing both Soviet troops and the threat of internal unrest, accepted terms that effectively handed their country to Moscow. The Romanian monarchy remained for a few years, but it was a monarchy in name only, a relic kept in place to maintain the illusion of normalcy. By the time the communists formally abolished the monarchy in 1947 and declared the People's Republic, the transformation was already complete. Romania had fallen not through conquest alone, but through a deception campaign that convinced the world, and eventually many Romanians themselves, that Soviet control was the inevitable outcome of history. Bulgaria's story followed a similar path, though with some regional variations. Unlike Romania, Bulgaria entered the war with minimal enthusiasm for the Axis cause and avoided sending troops against the Soviet Union. Stalin recognized this nuance and tailored his disinformation strategies accordingly. Instead of portraying Bulgaria as a defeated enemy, Soviet propaganda depicted it as a victim of German manipulation and a nation ready for socialist rebirth. When Soviet troops crossed the Danube in 1944, they encountered little resistance. But the political vacuum that followed was filled not by democratic forces, but by Soviet-trained Bulgarian communists who had been living in exile in Moscow. NKVD agents escorted them back into the country, presenting them as national heroes who had returned to restore Bulgarian independence. Their speeches, carefully scripted and broadcast across the country, emphasized themes of unity, renewal, and justice, never admitting that their authority came from Moscow, not from the Bulgarian people. As in Romania, state tribunals played a crucial role. The people's courts were established with NKVD advisors embedded in the judicial process. These courts prosecuted members of the previous government for war crimes, a process that carried a veneer of legitimacy but relied heavily on fabricated evidence and coerced testimony. Hundreds of Bulgarian officials were executed or imprisoned, not because they were guilty, but because removing them cleared the way for Soviet influence to take root without opposition. To foreign observers, Bulgaria's transition appeared less chaotic than Romania's. The new government spoke the language of reform, progress, and national redemption. But beneath this rhetoric lay a calculated strategy, the rewriting of Bulgarian political culture through a narrative that portrayed communism as both native and inevitable. Soviet propaganda cast the monarchy as obsolete, the old parties as corrupt, and the communists as the only force capable of leading Bulgaria into a peaceful future. Over time, the illusion became accepted reality. By the late 1940s, Romania and Bulgaria were firmly within Moscow's orbit. Their parliaments passed resolutions drafted by Soviet advisors. Their security services were reorganized under NKVD guidance. Their textbooks taught a Soviet-approved version of history, and their borders, once fluid and contested, were now anchored to an emerging geopolitical order, one defined not by treaties, but by deception and fear. Yet even as Stalin secured the Balkans, a larger challenge loomed in the heart of Europe. Germany, the defeated, divided giant, represented both the greatest threat and the greatest prize in the post-war settlement. To shape its future, Stalin unleashed another wave of disinformation, one aimed not at a single nation, but at the entire Western world. Germany was the center of gravity in post-war Europe, a nation shattered physically, morally, and politically, yet still possessing the industrial potential to rise again. For Stalin, Germany represented both danger and opportunity. If the West controlled it, Germany could become a capitalist stronghold on the Soviet border. If the Soviets controlled it, Germany could become the anchor of a socialist Europe. And if neither side controlled it entirely, Germany could become the wedge that fractured the Western alliance. Stalin chose the third path. Through a calculated blend of disinformation, political engineering, and strategic obstruction, he transformed the German question into the first great battlefield of the Cold War. The foundation of Stalin's strategy was simple: never allow a unified, independent Germany to emerge unless it was aligned with Moscow. To achieve this, the Soviets portrayed themselves publicly as champions of German unity, while privately sabotaging every attempt to create a functioning national government that was not under their control. The deception began almost immediately after the war, when Allied leaders assembled in Berlin to determine how to govern the occupied nation. At the Potsdam Conference, Stalin's delegation arrived armed with thick dossiers describing German political sentiment, economic capacity, and social attitudes. Much of the information had been fabricated or selectively altered. NKVD analysts exaggerated the prevalence of German left-wing parties in the Soviet occupation zone, claiming these groups represented a spontaneous desire for socialist governance. They minimized the presence of anti-communist resistance, dismissed reports of dissatisfaction with Soviet troops, and presented the eastern regions as docile, cooperative, and ready for political transformation. Western diplomats lacking independent access to Soviet-controlled areas were forced to rely on these reports, even when inconsistencies raised suspicion. The next phase of Stalin's deception involved Germany's political reconstruction. While the Western Allies encouraged a pluralistic political landscape, the Soviet occupation authorities took a very different approach. They forced the merger of the Communist Party of Germany, KPD, with the moderate Social Democratic Party, SPD, in their zone, creating the Socialist Unity Party, SED. This merger was presented as a voluntary unification of workers' movements eager to build a new socialist Germany. In reality, it was orchestrated through intimidation, surveillance, and propaganda. SPD members who resisted found themselves labeled as fascist sympathizers, pressured into silence, or arrested on charges fabricated by Soviet intelligence. To the outside world, however, the newly formed SED appeared to represent a broad coalition of progressive forces. Soviet reports sent to the Allied Control Council described the merger as wildly popular, suggesting that a unified socialist party could serve as the foundation for a democratic German state. This narrative was designed to undermine Western plans for a multi-party system and to present the Soviet model as the most efficient path to reconstruction. Economic disinformation formed another pillar of Stalin's strategy. The Soviets claimed that Germany's industrial resources should be dismantled or relocated to compensate for Soviet losses, an argument supported by inflated estimates of war damage and exaggerated portrayals of German economic capacity. Factories in the East were stripped of machinery, which was shipped by train to the Soviet Union as reparations. But to justify their actions diplomatically, Soviet officials insisted that the removals were necessary to prevent Germany's militarization and to maintain European stability. Meanwhile, NKVD agents embedded in German institutions spread rumors that the Western Allies planned to permanently divide Germany and exploit its western regions for capitalist gain. These rumors, blended with selective truth about British and American economic policies, fed into public fears and resentment. At the same time, Soviet propaganda portrayed the USSR as the only power genuinely committed to German unity, even as Moscow systematically prevented that unity from becoming reality. The turning point came during the crisis over currency reform in 1948. When the Western Allies introduced the Deutsche Mark in their zones to stabilize the economy, Stalin responded with outrage, claiming the reform was a plot to divide the nation. He presented himself as defender of German sovereignty, arguing that the Western powers were violating agreements and preparing to isolate the Soviet zone economically. In truth, Stalin feared a stable West German economy far more than he feared division. So NKVD operatives circulated forged documents suggesting secret Western plans to build a separate German state, using these fakes to justify the Soviet blockade of Berlin. The Berlin blockade, one of the defining confrontations of the early Cold War, was itself built on disinformation. Soviet radio broadcasts announced that the blockade was a protective measure requested by the German people. Newspapers in the Eastern Zone published articles claiming that American and British aircraft were delivering weapons, not supplies, to West Berlin. Every Soviet action was framed as necessary to preserve peace. Every Western response was portrayed as aggressive. And though the Berlin airlift ultimately defeated the blockade, Stalin achieved his primary goal. He ensured that Germany would not be reunited on Western terms. By the time the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, emerged as separate states in 1949, the division of the country was presented by Soviet propaganda as an unavoidable consequence of Western imperialism. The truth, that Stalin had engineered the division through misdirection and sabotage, was lost beneath layers of official rhetoric. Germany had become the first major casualty of the Cold War's information war. Its division was not simply the result of geopolitical disagreement, but of a deliberate campaign to manipulate perceptions, distort facts, and force the West into defensive positions. And as Stalin solidified control over Eastern Europe, his most ambitious disinformation campaign was still unfolding, one aimed at shaping global opinion, not just regional politics. As the map of Europe hardened into spheres of influence, Stalin understood that the struggle for dominance would not be won on the continent alone. The post-war world was an open arena of nations recovering from devastation, emerging from colonialism, or redefining their political identity. Their perceptions of the Soviet Union, of the West, and of the balance of global power would shape the future of international politics. And so, Stalin broadened his campaign. What had begun as a regional strategy of secrecy and manipulation evolved into a global propaganda offensive designed to recast the Soviet Union not as a looming empire, but as the world's strongest advocate for peace, anti-fascism, and liberation. The cornerstone of this offensive was the narrative that the Soviet Union had been the primary force responsible for defeating Nazi Germany. This was a truth, but a selective one, reframed and amplified until the Red Army's sacrifices became the central myth of Soviet international identity. Soviet media emphasized the colossal losses suffered on the Eastern Front, the liberation of concentration camps, and the symbolic destruction of Hitler's Reichstag. These facts were real, but they were retold with a singular purpose: to present the USSR as morally unassailable. Any criticism of Soviet actions, from the occupation of Eastern Europe to the suppression of political freedom, could then be deflected with a simple accusation that the critic was ungrateful for the Soviet victory over fascism. This strategy proved remarkably effective. Across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where memories of Western colonial rule were still raw, Soviet messages resonated deeply. They cast the USSR as an ally of the oppressed, a champion of revolution, and a defender against Western imperialism. Disinformation campaigns portrayed communist movements abroad as grassroots struggles for justice, while painting Western-backed governments as corrupt, elitist, or aligned with the remnants of fascism. Even when these movements were heavily supported, trained, or financed by Moscow, Soviet propaganda insisted they were organic expressions of local will. To project this image globally, the Soviets used an extensive network of organizations that appeared independent, but were controlled behind the scenes. The World Peace Council, supposedly an international coalition of activists, operated as a vehicle for promoting Soviet foreign policy under the guise of pacifism. Trade unions across Europe and Asia received funding funneled quietly through NKVD channels, enabling pro-Soviet leaders to dominate labor movements and influence governments. Writers, filmmakers, and intellectuals sympathetic to the USSR were elevated through awards, conferences, and publications that framed their voices as part of a global struggle for justice. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence agencies fed manipulated information to newspapers and radio broadcasters around the world. Stories of Western espionage, economic exploitation, and alleged war crimes were circulated. Half-truths carefully blended with fabrications. In some cases, NKVD agents forged documents purporting to reveal secret agreements among Western powers. Knowing that once such claims reached public consciousness, even their debunking would not erase the seeds of doubt they planted. Stalin's goal was not to convince everyone of Soviet purity. It was to erode trust in Western institutions and create an informational environment where Soviet motives appeared at least equally valid. Inside the United States and Britain, communist parties and front groups presented the USSR as a misunderstood partner unfairly maligned by capitalist governments. Soviet cultural centers hosted exhibitions highlighting Soviet achievements in science, education, and reconstruction. Films showed factories rising from the ashes of Stalingrad, children learning in bright modern classrooms, farmers harvesting wheat under banners of unity. The message was clear. The USSR was building a better future, while the West clung to outdated systems of exploitation. To reinforce this image, the Soviets exploited racial injustice in the West, particularly in the United States. NKVD-linked organizations circulated stories of segregation, lynching, and discrimination, contrasting them with idealized depictions of Soviet equality. Never mind that ethnic minorities in the USSR faced their own repression or forced relocations. What mattered was the narrative, one that positioned the Soviet Union as morally superior, a nation where racism had been solved, and where workers of all backgrounds supposedly lived in harmony. For many observers abroad, especially those disillusioned by colonial legacies, these messages carried real appeal. Stalin's propaganda offensive also extended into the United Nations. From the moment the organization was founded, Soviet diplomats worked tirelessly to shape resolutions, influence committees, and present the USSR as the defender of international peace. Whenever the United States or Britain opposed Soviet initiatives, Moscow portrayed them as warmongers pushing the world toward another conflict. Conversely, every Soviet veto or obstruction was framed as a necessary action to prevent aggression. In this arena, disinformation took the form of diplomatic language. Subtle, coded, but highly effective. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Stalin's global deception was how sophisticated it became. Soviet operatives blended ideology with cultural diplomacy, espionage with journalism, and statecraft with storytelling. They recognized that people were drawn to narratives of justice, struggle, and redemption, and they crafted a version of the Soviet Union that embodied those ideals. For a time, it worked. Across the world, millions viewed the USSR not as an empire, but as a beacon, a nation that had suffered, risen, and now offered hope to others. But behind this carefully curated image, the internal reality of the Soviet system was becoming increasingly harsh. Repression intensified, purges continued, nationalities were displaced, and dissent, even in the newly annexed territories, was handled with the same brutality that had defined Stalin's rule for decades. Yet these realities remained hidden behind walls of secrecy and rivers of propaganda. Stalin's global disinformation offensive set the stage for a larger conflict, one fought not only through armies and weapons, but through perception, ideology, and the manipulation of truth. It shaped the early Cold War, influenced the politics of emerging nations, and created a world in which competing realities battled for dominance. But as the Soviet Union expanded its influence abroad, the cost of its internal deception was rising. Within its own borders, entire populations were being uprooted, rewritten, and silenced. And at the heart of this internal manipulation was a system of forced deportations and falsified national histories, designed to extinguish resistance and reshape identities. Inside the Soviet Union, Stalin's mastery of disinformation took on a far more intimate and devastating form. While foreign governments struggled to pass Soviet motives abroad, entire peoples within the USSR were being recast, relocated, or erased according to Stalin's shifting geopolitical needs. Borders could be redrawn on maps, but populations were harder to manage. They carried memories, languages, loyalties, and histories that did not always align with Soviet narratives. And so, Stalin did what he had done since the early years of his rule. He rewrote reality by rewriting the people themselves. The deportations that swept through the USSR during and after the war were not only acts of punishment, they were acts of narrative engineering. Stalin understood that identity was a threat when it conflicted with his political goals. Nations with strong cultural traditions, independent religious life, or histories of resisting Moscow's rule were viewed as unstable elements. Populations that could be manipulated by foreign powers or serve as seeds of rebellion. The NKVD labeled these groups unreliable, a term so broad it included everyone from entire ethnicities to families suspected of harboring the wrong memories. The scale was staggering. Between 1941 and 1949, more than 2 million people were forcibly uprooted from their homes and transported to distant regions of Siberia, Central Asia, or the Caucasus. Each deportation had its own justification, each wrapped in a disinformation narrative tailored to Stalin's needs. The Volga Germans were accused of aiding the Nazis, even though most had remained loyal Soviet citizens. The Crimean Tatars were collectively blamed for collaboration, despite thousands fighting in the Red Army. Chechens and Ingushirs were deported for alleged banditry and treason, their entire national identities condemned in a single sweep. The list went on. Kalmyks, Balkars, Meskhetian Turks, Karachi's. Entire cultures were loaded into cattle cars, transported thousands of kilometers, and scattered across the Soviet interior like dust. But the brutality of the deportations was only the first layer. The deeper deception lay in what followed. Once these peoples were removed, Soviet administrators rewrote the histories of their homelands. Libraries were purged, school curricula were revised, maps were redrawn to show simplified narratives of peaceful, multi-ethnic belonging under Soviet rule. In some cases, erased communities were replaced with settlers from other regions, altering the demographic landscape and reinforcing the idea that the displaced population had never truly belonged there to begin with. Even the names of towns and geographical landmarks were changed, a symbolic erasure etched into the geography itself. These internal deceptions were designed to serve Stalin both domestically and internationally. By controlling the narrative of who lived where and why, he could justify territorial claims externally and maintain political stability internally. If an ethnic group disappeared from a region on paper, its grievances, memories, and competing claims disappeared as well. And with no independent media, no foreign observers, and no public archives, there was no one left who could publicly contradict the Soviet version of events. For the populations who endured these deportations, life in exile became a kind of suspended reality. In remote, harsh settlements, their cultural institutions were dismantled, their leaders imprisoned or executed, and their children taught histories that denied the very existence of their homeland. Speaking the truth became an act of rebellion. Memory itself became a liability. The Soviet Union expected not only obedience, but acceptance of the lie, a willingness to participate in one's own erasure. Meanwhile, the NKVD documented the deportations in reports crafted to justify the operations as necessary measures for national security. These reports were carefully worded to present the relocations as humane, orderly, and welcomed by local populations. Western governments, with no access to the regions affected, could not challenge these claims. Many diplomats assumed the deportations were temporary wartime measures. Few understood that Stalin intended them to be permanent alterations of the Soviet Union's demographic and political landscape. The internal deception did not stop at moving people. It extended to reshaping entire national histories. School textbooks in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states were rewritten to emphasize the voluntary nature of their incorporation into the USSR. Resistance movements like the Ukrainian UPA, the Baltic Forest Brothers, and Polish Home Army veterans were branded fascists, criminals, or agents of imperialism, labels repeated so relentlessly that they became accepted truths by new generations. Soviet historians carefully curated narratives that portrayed Stalin not as a conqueror, but as a unifier and protector. In the Baltic states, the deception was especially stark. The Soviet annexation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in 1940 had been illegal under international law. But Soviet propaganda reframed it as the result of popular uprisings and workers' movements. NKVD officers forged petitions, staged demonstrations, and installed puppet legislatures that requested incorporation into the USSR. After the war, this fiction became foundational. The occupation was described as liberation, the mass deportations as the dismantling of bourgeois nationalist resistance, and the populations who suffered most were silenced under the weight of official narrative. Even within Russia itself, Stalin manipulated identity on a massive scale. Entire chapters of history were sanitized. Heroes of the revolution vanished from photographs. Military failures became victories. Purges became necessary precautions. And the cult of Stalin grew as the ultimate truth, the one history that could not be questioned. What made these internal manipulations so effective was the complete absence of alternative voices. Where the West could challenge Soviet lies abroad, inside the USSR, there was no counterbalance. The Soviet state controlled every channel of communication, from newspapers to academic institutions. Language, memory, and culture became instruments of state power, and the truth, however painful or obvious, was buried beneath layers of fear and silence. But the consequences of these internal rewrites extended far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. They shaped the way the world understood Eastern Europe for decades. They influenced diplomatic negotiations, academic research, and international policy. And they helped solidify an empire that appeared stable, legitimate, and cohesive, even as its foundations were built on coercion and distortion. Yet as Stalin tightened his grip on the nations under his control, a new challenge emerged, a confrontation not of armies or borders, but of competing realities. For the first time, the West began to understand the scale of Soviet manipulation, and this realization would ignite one of the defining conflicts of the 20th century. For years after the war, Western governments clung to the hope that cooperation with the Soviet Union was still possible. They had fought together, negotiated together, rebuilt together, and in public, at least, Stalin spoke the language of peace, stability, and collective security. But beneath the surface, Western intelligence services were confronting a growing pattern of contradictions, mismatches between Soviet claims and observable reality, sudden political shifts in Eastern Europe that defied diplomatic expectations, and reports from behind the Iron Curtain that hinted at a much darker truth. It was in these shadows, in the quiet offices of analysts and codebreakers, that the West finally began to understand the scale of Stalin's disinformation war. The realization did not come suddenly. It emerged gradually, in fragments. A testimony smuggled out of Poland, a coded message intercepted in Berlin, a puzzling report from an American officer stationed in Vienna. Early intelligence assessments described inconsistencies in Soviet-provided data, but few analysts yet grasped that these inconsistencies were features, not flaws. The NKVD had created a system so airtight that most Western observers could see only what Moscow allowed them to see. Elections looked orderly, assemblies looked unified. The narrative appeared consistent, until refugees fleeing Soviet rule began to tell their stories. These refugees, arriving in displaced persons camps across Europe, described rigged ballots, arrests carried out at night, orchestrated propaganda, and the disappearance of political rivals. At first, Western authorities were skeptical. The accounts were emotional, fragmented, sometimes contradictory. But as thousands of similar testimonies poured in, patterns emerged. The stories matched, the timelines aligned, and the techniques described — intimidation, forged documents, NKVD infiltration — mirrored the methods the Soviets had perfected during the purges of the 1930s. What had once been isolated accusations gradually formed a mosaic of systemic manipulation. British intelligence was among the first to recognize the deeper implications. MI6 analysts studying Eastern Europe noticed that political transitions in Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Poland followed an identical script, despite cultural and political differences. NKVD officers always controlled security ministries. Coalition governments always collapsed in favor of communist dominance. Elections always resulted in overwhelming support for Soviet-aligned parties. These were not spontaneous national developments. They were coordinated operations executed with military precision. By 1946, MI6 concluded that the Soviets were engaged in a strategic campaign to reshape the political landscape of Europe. But the most decisive shift in Western understanding came from signals intelligence, the secret world of intercepted communication. As cryptographers began piecing together fragments of Soviet messages, they noticed something extraordinary. Soviet diplomats abroad were receiving instructions that contradicted their public statements. Messages emphasized delaying Western initiatives, denying access to Soviet-held regions, and spreading rumors about Western militarism. The coded orders made clear what Stalin would never admit openly. The USSR was not cooperating with the West. It was undermining the West. American intelligence reached the same conclusion. The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the wartime predecessor to the CIA, had been dissolved in 1945, but many of its analysts continued to study the Soviet Union in new government roles. They observed that every diplomatic engagement with Moscow followed a predictable pattern. Requests for transparency were deflected, joint commissions were stalled, and Soviet representatives arrived armed with thick stacks of documents that always supported their predetermined position. When the Cold War began to crystallize, these analysts understood why. The documents had been curated or fabricated to enforce a narrative that served Stalin's interests. One memo circulating through the State Department in 1946 captured the growing alarm. It described the USSR as an authoritarian system incapable of honest diplomacy, whose leaders viewed negotiations as opportunities not for compromise, but for advantage. The memo warned that Soviet manipulation of political life in Eastern Europe was not an anomaly, but the foundation of a new geopolitical order. At the time, some policymakers dismissed the assessment as overly cynical, but within a year, events across Europe would prove it correct. The turning point came with George Kennan's long telegram sent from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in February 1946. Kennan, drawing from years of diplomatic experience and extensive intelligence briefings, provided the clearest articulation yet of Soviet strategy. He described a government that used secrecy and deception as tools of governance, a leadership that believed the world was divided between hostile camps, and a political system that could never tolerate independent nations on its borders. The telegram concluded that Soviet behavior abroad was inseparable from Soviet repression at home. The lies that shaped internal politics were the same lies the USSR exported to reshape the world. Kennan's analysis struck Washington with the force of revelation. What Western leaders had interpreted as diplomatic disagreements were, in fact, the outward expression of a regime whose survival depended on controlling information. The Soviets were not negotiating in good faith. They were crafting illusions, managing perceptions, and rewriting political landscapes before the West could react. For many in the American government, the long telegram marked the moment they understood that Stalin's disinformation war was not a temporary post-war tactic. It was the operating principle of the Soviet system itself. British leaders came to a similar conclusion when Winston Churchill delivered his famous Iron Curtain speech in March 1946. Behind that curtain, he said, lies the tragedy of Poland, a nation whose political life had been extinguished by Soviet deception. Churchill spoke cautiously, but his meaning was clear. The Soviet Union had built its empire not just through military occupation, but through fraud. The forging of governments, documents, histories, and identities. By 1947, the West had shed the last illusions of wartime unity. Intelligence services began actively challenging Soviet narratives, exposing forged documents and developing counter-propaganda strategies. The Marshall Plan, designed to rebuild Europe, was as much an economic project as it was an informational one, a demonstration that the West could offer stability and prosperity where Soviet influence brought only repression and fear. Yet even as the West awakened to the scale of Stalin's deception, it faced a new problem: how to fight an adversary that operated not through open aggression, but through the manipulation of truth itself. The Cold War would be shaped not only by nuclear arsenals and military alliances, but by a contest over perception, a struggle between competing realities on a global scale. And in this new phase of conflict, Stalin's methods would evolve again. Having secured Eastern Europe and established the foundations of a divided world, he turned to the final phase of his disinformation empire, controlling the memory of the war itself. As the 1940s came to an end, Stalin faced a reality he could not ignore. The Soviet Union had survived the war, expanded its borders, and reshaped half of Europe. But the victory had come at an unimaginable cost. 27 million Soviet citizens were dead. Entire cities had been erased. And beneath the triumph lay a truth Stalin feared more than any enemy: that the Soviet people might remember not only the glory of victory, but also the failures and betrayals that had led to their suffering. The early defeats, the purges of the officer corps, the non-aggression pact with Hitler, the mass deportations, these were cracks in the facade, fractures that threatened the myth Stalin needed to maintain absolute control. And so, as he had done so many times before, he turned to disinformation. But this time, the stakes were even higher. He was not rewriting borders or political systems. He was rewriting the past itself. The war that most of the world remembered, the war that began in 1939 with the German invasion of Poland, was not the war Stalin wanted remembered. In the Soviet version, the conflict began in 1941, with the surprise attack on the USSR. Everything that happened before, the partition of Poland, the occupation of the Baltic states, the invasion of Finland, was reframed, minimized, or erased entirely. Official histories declared that the Soviet Union had been forced into these actions by the threat of Nazi aggression, ignoring the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that had divided Eastern Europe between two dictators. Maps produced after the war showed the Soviet borders as eternal and natural, with no mention of the agreements that had created them. To shape this narrative, Stalin launched a comprehensive rewriting of textbooks, military memoirs, newsreels, and cultural works. Writers who deviated from the official line faced censorship, arrest, or execution. Museums were redesigned to emphasize Soviet heroism while eliminating any trace of Stalin's strategic blunders. Entire campaigns that had led to massive casualties were described as inevitable sacrifices or brilliant maneuvers. The disaster at Kiev in 1941, which resulted in the encirclement of more than 500,000 Soviet soldiers, was reframed as a temporary setback caused by the treachery of enemies within, a subtle return to the logic of the purges. At the center of this effort was the cult of the Great Patriotic War. It became not just a historical era, but a mythic foundation of Soviet identity, a story in which the Soviet people, united under Stalin's leadership, had saved the world from fascism. This myth was reinforced at every level of society. Schoolchildren were taught simplified timelines that omitted politically sensitive events. Films portrayed Stalin as a calm, wise commander, even though he had panicked during the first days of the German invasion and retreated into seclusion. Posters showed him directing the defense of Moscow, though in reality, it was Zhukov and other generals who had devised the strategy. Zhukov, in fact, became a problem. The Marshal's enormous popularity threatened Stalin's narrative of singular leadership. He had become a living symbol of military genius, something Stalin could not tolerate. And so, in the years after the war, Zhukov was quietly removed from the public eye, reassigned to obscure posts, and watched closely by Soviet security services. His memoirs were edited heavily before publication, with entire sections removed because they contradicted the image Stalin wanted preserved. Even the liberation of Eastern Europe was rewritten. Soviet historians described it as a voluntary uprising of workers and peasants, supported by Red Army assistance. The occupations, the political manipulation, the NKVD purges, all of these vanished from the official record. In their place, the Soviet Union appeared as a benevolent guardian, welcomed by grateful nations eager to join the socialist world. This version of history became so dominant that, for decades, many outside the Eastern Bloc underestimated the extent of Soviet coercion. But the most audacious element of Stalin's memory war was his attempt to erase the role of the West. Lend-Lease aid, the tanks, trucks, aircraft, food, and industrial materials that had been essential to Soviet survival went unmentioned in textbooks. The D-Day landings were described as a minor operation conducted only after the Red Army had already broken the back of the Wehrmacht. British efforts in North Africa, American advances in the Pacific, the bombing campaigns over Germany, all were minimized or ignored entirely. The Soviet Union became the sole architect of victory, the force that had saved civilization while the West hesitated. This narrative was not just propaganda, it was political strategy. By casting the USSR as the heroic pillar of global peace, Stalin justified his control over Eastern Europe and framed Western criticism as ingratitude or hostility. If the Soviet Union had saved the world, then its dominance was not imperialism, it was responsibility. But Stalin's war of memory reached its most chilling form in the realm of state secrecy. Archives were sealed, documents rewritten, and inconvenient truths classified indefinitely. Researchers who attempted to access restricted files risked accusations of espionage. The NKVD even falsified internal records to ensure that future Soviet historians would never stumble upon the truth. Lies became institutionalized, fabrication became canon, and memory became a tool of governance. It was in this environment that the early Cold War took shape, a conflict defined not only by weapons and diplomacy, but by competing versions of history itself. The world Stalin created was one in which truth and fiction could not be easily distinguished, where entire nations operated on narratives crafted to serve a single man's vision. For decades, these narratives held, shaping global opinion and influencing international relations. Even after Stalin's death, many of his myths endured, embedded in the institutions he had built and the memories he had forced upon millions. Yet as the Cold War unfolded, the cracks in Stalin's story began to widen. New leaders emerged. Archives were opened selectively. Historians, journalists, and former prisoners began to speak. And the world began to understand the enormity of the deception that had shaped the post-war era. But before that reckoning came, Stalin had one final objective: to ensure that his version of the world, his map, his borders, his truths, would survive him. And so he turned inward once more, reshaping the Soviet political landscape in his final years with the same ruthlessness that had defined his rise. In the twilight of his reign, Stalin stood atop an empire shaped as much by fear as by fabrication. The war was over, the borders were drawn, and Eastern Europe lay firmly beneath the Soviet boot. Yet Stalin was not a man capable of resting on victory. He saw threats everywhere, in foreign capitals, among his allies, and even within the walls of the Kremlin. His final years became a frantic effort to lock his version of the post-war world into permanence, to ensure that no shift in political winds could undo the reality he had manufactured through decades of deception. These last maneuvers were quieter than the grand diplomatic battles of Yalta or Potsdam, but their shadows stretched deep into the Cold War, shaping tensions that would define the global order long after Stalin's death. The first target of his final deception campaign was his own government. Stalin feared that the generation of leaders who had risen during the war, men like Zhukov, Beria, and Molotov, possessed too much authority, too much knowledge, and too much potential for independent thought. In their hands, the truth of Soviet wartime failures, internal terror, and strategic miscalculations could become dangerous. So Stalin began methodically isolating and dismantling his own circle, accusing long-trusted comrades of treason, nationalism, and ideological impurity. Each accusation was supported by forged letters, fabricated intelligence reports, or coerced confessions. These documents circulated through the upper ranks of the Communist Party like poison, seeding paranoia and eliminating anyone who might one day challenge the myths Stalin had constructed. Even the doctors who treated him fell victim to this final purge. In 1952, Stalin launched the infamous Doctors' Plot, accusing a group of mostly Jewish physicians of conspiring with Western intelligence to assassinate Soviet leaders. The case was built entirely on fabricated evidence assembled by the MGB, the successor to the NKVD. The real purpose was not medical, it was political. Stalin intended to purge what remained of the wartime generation, replacing older elites with younger, more malleable officials who had grown up entirely within the world he created, a world where truth was whatever the state said it was. Had Stalin lived even a year longer, the Doctors' Plot might have ignited another wave of mass repression, reshaping the internal map of the USSR once again. Beyond the Kremlin, Stalin's late-era deceptions focused on securing the Soviet sphere against ideological contamination. His intelligence agencies intensified their operations in Eastern Europe, rooting out anyone suspected of harboring Western sympathies. Show trials in Prague, Budapest, and Warsaw presented grotesque theatrical versions of justice, complete with forced confessions describing vast imaginary conspiracies. Each trial served a dual purpose, eliminating potential rivals and reinforcing the narrative that only one, the Soviet Union, could be trusted to preserve the peace won in 1945. In these final years, Stalin was not expanding his empire. He was fortifying it with walls of lies and fear. But Stalin's late disinformation campaigns extended beyond oppression. They were also about legacy. He understood that memory was the most powerful map of all, more enduring than any border. So he carefully crafted how he wanted future generations to see him and his world. Monuments rose in every major city of the USSR, depicting him as the architect of victory, the father of nations, the genius who led his people through the fires of war. Textbooks portrayed him as a visionary leader whose decisions were guided by wisdom rather than paranoia. State-approved biographies erased his rivals from history or reduced them to footnotes. Even his disastrous agricultural policies were written as triumphs. It was a portrait painted in broad strokes and bold colors. A portrait designed to obscure the darker truth beneath. Yet beneath the grandeur of the myth, the contradictions were becoming impossible to ignore. Economic stagnation, food shortages, and quiet murmurs of dissent crept through the Soviet system like cracks in a monument. In Eastern Europe, the regimes Stalin had installed through disinformation and repression were beginning to wobble under their own contradictions. Workers in East Germany protested in 1953. Intellectuals in Poland whispered of lost freedoms. Hungarian veterans of the war saw their sacrifices twisted into propaganda. Stalin's empire held, but its foundations were brittle, held together more by fear than by loyalty. Still, Stalin believed he had succeeded. He died in March 1953, convinced that he had secured not only the Soviet Union's future, but its version of the past. He believed his maps, the literal ones etched onto post-war Europe and the metaphorical ones written into the minds of millions, would endure unchanged. And in many ways, they did. The borders he drew remained in place for decades. The governments he installed survived on borrowed time, but survived nonetheless. And the myths he created continued to shape global perception long after he was gone. But the greatest legacy of Stalin's disinformation war was not territorial or political. It was psychological. He had revealed, with ruthless clarity, that truth could be weaponized as effectively as tanks or guns. He had demonstrated that nations could be conquered not only by armies but by narratives, that borders could be redrawn not only through treaties but through the manipulation of memory. The Cold War that followed was shaped as much by competing truths as by competing ideologies. Propaganda became a global battlefield, history a contested terrain. And every deception Stalin deployed left a blueprint for future conflicts. A reminder that the struggle for reality itself had become part of international warfare. Stalin's death did not end his disinformation empire. The institutions he built, the propaganda machinery, the intelligence networks, the censorship apparatus, continued to operate, sometimes with the same zeal, sometimes with the same methods. But without Stalin's singular vision, the system gradually fractured. Soviet leaders began cautiously acknowledging certain truths, opening archives selectively, allowing historians to touch the shadows Stalin had hidden. Yet even as the truth emerged, the damage remained. The borders he redrew could not be undone without unimaginable upheaval. The narratives he implanted survived in classrooms, monuments, and national memories. The lies he constructed endured long enough to shape the moral and political landscape of the entire Cold War. Stalin had redrawn the post-war map with armies, but he had redrawn the world with deception. And the world, divided and uncertain, would spend decades living in the reality he left behind. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, it seemed for a moment that the truth might sweep away the shadows of the past. Archives opened. Historians gained access to documents long sealed under Stalin's orders. Survivors told stories that had been forbidden for half a century. Governments that had lived under Soviet domination began rewriting their histories, restoring memories that had been buried beneath layers of fear and propaganda. But even as the truth emerged, it became clear that Stalin's disinformation war had left a deeper imprint, one that extended far beyond the borders of the former USSR. His manipulation of history, identity, and perception had not ended with his death. It had become woven into the political DNA of an entire region, its echoes still resonating across the world. The first legacy lay in the borders themselves. The map of Eastern Europe, from the Baltic states to the Black Sea, still bore the lines Stalin had insisted upon at Yalta and Potsdam. These borders, drawn under the influence of forged reports, coerced testimonies, and manufactured demographic data, became the fault lines of modern geopolitics. Nations that had been split or shifted, Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, continued to grapple with the consequences of those imposed boundaries. The scars of deportations, population transfers, and rewritten histories shaped the identities of entire generations. And disputes that Stalin had frozen in place through deception resurfaced the moment his empire crumbled. Nowhere was this more evident than in Ukraine and the Baltic states. For decades, Soviet propaganda had denied the existence of Ukrainian nationalism, dismissed Baltic independence movements as fascist plots, and erased the collective trauma of deportations. When these nations regained sovereignty, they faced an immediate struggle to reclaim their narratives, to reintroduce erased memories, restore forbidden languages, and rebuild identities that Stalin had tried to extinguish. Yet the echoes of Soviet disinformation remained. Even today, conflicts over history, interpretations of the war, the legitimacy of borders, the meaning of national identity, continue to fuel political tensions and international disputes. The battle over truth, shaped by Stalin's methods, did not end with the collapse of his empire. It evolved into a contest that still defines geopolitics in the region. The second legacy was ideological. Stalin had crafted a narrative in which the Soviet Union was the guardian of peace, the liberator of Europe, the champion of anti-fascism. This narrative survived long after his death, influencing how millions understood the 20th century. In parts of the world deeply shaped by colonialism, Soviet propaganda found fertile ground. Movements that opposed Western influence often adopted Soviet perspectives, not because they believed in communism, but because Stalin's narrative had framed the USSR as the moral counterweight to Western power. This perception, built on decades of disinformation, shaped alliances, political movements, and educational systems throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Even after the dissolution of the USSR, the residue of this propaganda persisted. In many countries, Soviet-era myths about World War II remained deeply rooted, reinforced by generations of textbooks, films, and diplomatic messaging. The idea of the Red Army as a purely liberating force, the downplaying of Soviet occupation in Eastern Europe, the erasure of Stalin's early collaboration with Hitler. These narratives continued to shape political discourse. The truth, long suppressed, struggled to compete with the weight of decades-long storytelling. But the most enduring legacy of Stalin's disinformation war lay not in territory or ideology, but in method. He demonstrated that controlling information could reshape the world as surely as armies could. He proved that narratives could outlast regimes, that manipulated truths could guide foreign policy, that myths could become geopolitical tools. The Cold War, in many ways, was fought through the blueprint Stalin created, a contest over perception, influence, and the control of reality. And even after the Cold War ended, the strategies he pioneered lived on. Modern geopolitics still bears the imprint of Stalin's approach. States use propaganda to influence foreign elections, shape international opinion, and destabilize rivals. Intelligence services craft narratives to justify interventions or conceal failures. Social movements are amplified or undermined through targeted information campaigns. The new technologies of the 21st century, digital media, social networks, cyber warfare, have amplified the strategies Stalin once deployed with newspapers, forged documents, and controlled radio broadcasts. The tools have changed, but the logic remains the same. In Eastern Europe, the struggle over historical memory continues to shape alliances and conflicts. Debates about monuments, textbooks, and wartime responsibility remain politically charged, mirroring the narrative Stalin introduced decades ago. In Russia, where Stalin's reputation has undergone periodic rehabilitation, elements of his wartime mythology have been revived to bolster national pride and justify contemporary foreign policy. The narrative of liberation, the insistence on historic rights, the portrayal of critics as threats to stability, all echo the disinformation strategies Stalin perfected. Ultimately, the most unsettling legacy of Stalin's deception is the realization that truth itself can become a battlefield. The post-war world Stalin helped create was not divided only by ideology or power, but by competing realities. Some grounded in fact, others in carefully engineered fiction. And long after his death, the world continues to navigate the consequences of living in landscapes shaped by lies. Stalin's disinformation war did not end with the redrawing of the post-war map. It shaped the minds of millions, guided the politics of nations, and left a legacy of contested truths that continues to influence global events. His empire has collapsed, his monuments have fallen, and his crimes have been exposed. But the narratives he crafted, the borders he imposed, and the methods he pioneered still cast a long shadow. A reminder that power can reshape not only the future, but the past itself. In the end, Stalin's greatest victory was not won on any battlefield, nor sealed by any treaty. It was won in the shadows, in the quiet rewriting of documents, in the whispered manipulation of diplomats, in the staged elections, and forged reports that reshaped entire nations. It was a victory built not on tanks and artillery, but on the control of truth itself. When the last gun fell silent in 1945, most of the world believed the war was over. But for Stalin, it had simply entered its next phase. The armies withdrew, the rubble was cleared, and yet the most consequential conflict of all continued. The struggle to define what the world believed had happened and what it should believe going forward. By the time Stalin died in 1953, he had accomplished something unprecedented. He had redrawn the borders of Europe without ever admitting the coercion behind them. He had constructed governments that looked democratic but answered only to Moscow. He had erased entire populations from their homelands, replacing them with narratives crafted to legitimize his rule. He had concealed his greatest crimes beneath layers of manufactured evidence, and he had positioned the Soviet Union as the heroic architect of victory, even as he silenced those who knew the truth. Every continent felt the impact. In the West, the Cold War hardened into a global confrontation fueled not only by weapons, but by competing interpretations of the past. In the East, nations newly freed from colonial rule found themselves caught between narratives crafted in Washington and Moscow, each trying to shape their political future. And across the Soviet Union, millions lived inside a version of history molded by fear. A world where questioning the official story was not a matter of disagreement, but of survival. But perhaps the most haunting truth is this. Stalin understood the power of disinformation long before the world gave it a name. He recognized that if you controlled the story, you controlled the people. If you controlled the people, you controlled the state. And if you controlled the state, you controlled the map. Long after his empire collapsed, the techniques he perfected, the manipulation of identity, the distortion of memory, the weaponization of history, continued to shape global politics. His methods became templates used by states, movements, and intelligence agencies far beyond the Soviet sphere. To study Stalin's disinformation war is to confront the unsettling reality that maps are not just drawn by armies, but by narratives. Borders shift because stories shift. Nations rise or fall depending on which truths survive and which are buried. And in the years after World War II, Stalin buried many. Some have since been unearthed. Others remain hidden beneath the weight of propaganda, sealed in archives, or scattered across forgotten testimonies. But all of them remind us of the fragility of truth and the ease with which it can be sculpted by those who understand its power. The post-war world was not shaped solely by victory, but by deception. Not solely by treaties, but by the manipulation of perception. The Cold War was not merely a clash of ideologies, but a clash of realities engineered by leaders who knew that information could be as destructive and as decisive as any weapon. And at the center of this new kind of warfare was Joseph Stalin, a man who understood that controlling what people believed was the truest form of domination. His disinformation campaigns framed nations, rewrote histories, and redrew the map of Europe in ways that still influence global politics today. The legacy of his lies remains visible in contested borders, in disputed memories, in the ongoing battles over how we interpret the past. And the world, still living in the shadow of those lies, continues to navigate the consequences of Stalin's most enduring war. It is a war without a clear beginning or end, fought in classrooms and parliaments, in archives and newsrooms, in the quiet spaces where history is remembered or forgotten. A war that reminds us that truth can be silenced, but never fully destroyed. And that in the struggle to understand the past, we are also shaping the future. This has been Stalin's disinformation war that redrew the post-war map, a story of power, perception, and the invisible battle for reality itself. If you found this chapter of hidden history worth uncovering, make sure you're subscribed. Every week, we bring you deeper into the files the world tried to forget. The stories buried behind sealed archives, forged documents, and lost testimonies. Hit subscribe and join us as we continue decoding the past one secret at a time.